The unearthed secret. The days in Mary's small countryside home had fallen into a familiar rhythm. The mornings were slow, filled with the sound of the old kettle whistling and the soft patter of her German shepherd, Bruno, following her from room to room. The afternoons were spent in the rocking chair on the porch, watching the wind dance through the golden leaves of the trees lining her fence. And the nights, well, the nights were the hardest. The silence in the house was heavy. It had been years since her husband passed, and though she had learned to live with the quiet, there were moments when the loneliness pressed down on her chest like an invisible weight. Bruno, with his thick fur and kind eyes, was her only companion. He had been by her side through it all. Faithful, understanding, never asking for more than a kind word and a scratch behind the ears. But that autumn morning, something was different. Bruno was acting strangely. Mary first noticed it while sipping her tea on the porch. The dog stood near the old mailbox by the gate, his nose pressed against the damp earth, his paws scratching at the dirt, as if searching for something buried beneath. "Bruno," she called. The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't stop digging. Curious, Mary set her cup down and made her way toward him. The chill of the morning air nipped at her skin as she pulled her sweater tighter around her thin frame. "What are you doing, boy?" she asked, kneeling beside him. Bruno whined softly, his eyes darting from her to the patch of disturbed earth. Mary frowned. "Found something, have you?" She brushed away the loose soil with her hands, her fingers meeting something firm. Not a rock, not a root, but something else. Something man-made. She dug deeper, her pulse quickening. And then she saw it. An old, yellowed envelope, thick with waxed paper. The edges were worn, but the seal was intact. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned it over. There, written in familiar handwriting, was her name. Mary. Her fingers trembled. The date on the envelope minus 50 years ago. Her heart pounded in her chest. The handwriting. Oh, she knew that handwriting. She had traced those letters with her fingertips 1,000 times in her memories. John. She whispered the name, barely able to form the sound. The world around her faded, her vision blurred by the weight of the moment. A letter from John. From him. From the love she had lost so many years ago, and it had never reached her. Bruno nudged her gently, his warm breath grounding her back to the present. Hands shaking, she carefully broke the seal and unfolded the fragile sheet of paper inside. And as she read the words, the past came rushing back with the force of a tidal wave. A love lost in time. Mary's fingers trembled as she unfolded the brittle sheet of paper, its edges yellowed with time. The ink had faded slightly, but the words remained legible, preserved by the thick waxed paper that had protected it for decades. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Then she read, "Mary, if you still love me, meet me at the train station on Friday evening. I will wait. If you don't come, I will understand. But if there is anything left, anything at all, give me a sign. I won't leave until I see you. Forever yours, John." Her breath hitched. The paper slipped from her hands, landing gently on the grass below. The world spun. John. It had been so long since she had spoken that name out loud, yet it still carried the weight of every unsaid word, every regret, every moment that could have been. Her knees gave way, and she sank onto the damp earth, barely aware of Bruno nudging her with concern. John. Her first love. Her only love. 50 years. She had spent 50 years believing that he had moved on, that he had forgotten about her. And all this time, this letter, had been buried beneath her feet, lost in the ground, never reaching her hands when it was meant to. Her heart clenched as the memory surged forward, crashing over her like waves against jagged rocks. The love that almost was. Mary had met John in the summer of 1971. She had been barely 20, full of life and dreams, spending her days helping at her parents' little general store in town. John was a traveler, a young man passing through on his way to something bigger, something beyond their sleepy little town. But for those few weeks he had stayed. And for those few weeks, Mary had fallen helplessly in love. They spent their days walking through sun-drenched fields, talking about everything and nothing. John had a way of making the world feel bigger, brighter. He spoke of places she had never seen, of dreams he wanted to chase. But most of all, he spoke of them, of a future, of a life together. She had wanted to believe in it, but she was young, and the world was complicated, and love was terrifying. A misunderstanding had torn them apart, words spoken in anger, a letter never answered. And then he was gone. She had waited for weeks, hoping he would return. But he never did. Eventually, she convinced herself that he had never meant to stay, that she had been foolish to believe in a love like that. She moved on. She married another man, a good man, but never truly forgot. And now she knew the truth. John had waited. He had been there, at the train station, waiting for her to come, waiting for an answer that never arrived. The letter had never reached her. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the ache spread through her ribs. A choice to make. Bruno let out a low whine, breaking her from her thoughts. His brown eyes were filled with understanding, as if he knew what she was feeling. Mary wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and picked up the letter once more. She traced the words slowly, as if trying to absorb the emotions trapped in the ink. John had written this 50 years ago. 50 years. Was he even alive? Would he even remember? The logical part of her mind told her that there was no reason to believe he was still out there. That even if he had waited for a while, he would have eventually left, moved on, built a life without her. But her heart told her something else. She couldn't ignore the feeling that had settled in her chest, the small but powerful whisper that told her she needed to go. To the station. To the place where her life could have changed. Where maybe, just maybe, it still could. She took a shaky breath, folded the letter carefully, and held it close to her heart. Then, with Bruno trotting faithfully beside her, she made her way back inside the house. She had a journey to make. The journey back to yesterday. The old train station had stood at the edge of town for as long as Mary could remember. It was where young men had once left for war, and where lovers had once parted with tearful goodbyes. It was a place of beginnings and endings, of waiting and reunions. And now, for the first time in 50 years, it was calling her back. Mary tightened her shawl around her shoulders, the cool autumn breeze whispering through the trees as she stood at the small bus stop near her home. Bruno sat beside her, his ears perked, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. She had told herself she was foolish, that this was nothing but a desperate chase after something that no longer existed. But she was here, because something deep inside her refused to let go of the possibility, no matter how small, that she had one last chance to rewrite the past. As the bus pulled up with a soft hiss, she exhaled slowly and stepped inside. Bruno followed. The driver gave her an amused glance. "Taking your boy for a ride, Mary?" She nodded, offering a small, nervous smile. Something like that. She paid her fare and found a seat near the window, staring out at the town she had spent most of her life in. The roads, the houses, the familiar old oak tree near the market, they had all remained the same. But today, everything felt different. The folded letter in her pocket seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, as if it had been waiting for this journey just as much as she had. Memories in motion. The rhythmic hum of the bus was soothing, lulling her into thoughts she had long buried. She thought of the night John had left, of the argument that had torn them apart. It had been something so small, so meaningless in the grand scheme of things, a misunderstanding, one she hadn't been willing to clarify, too stubborn, too afraid of what his answer might have been. She had thought he would forget her, that he would move on. And yet, he had written that letter. He had waited. Had he waited long? Days, weeks, months? Or had he come back every Friday, hoping against hope that she would finally appear? She closed her eyes, guilt pressing down on her chest. Had she spent 50 years mourning a love she thought was lost, while he had spent those same years waiting for an answer that never came? A part of her wanted to believe that he had moved on, that he had found happiness elsewhere, married, had children, lived a life filled with laughter and joy. But what if he hadn't? What if he had waited for too long? Her fingers curled around the edge of the letter. It was too late to change the past. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to find closure. The station that time forgot. The bus pulled to a stop. Mary hesitated, her pulse quickening as she looked out the window. The train station looked almost exactly as she remembered it. The same faded benches, the same towering clock that had once dictated the departures and arrivals of travelers. Time had touched it, of course. The paint on the signs had peeled, and the platform was quieter than it used to be. But it was still there, just like John had been. Bruno let out a small whine, as if urging her forward. With a deep breath, Mary stood, stepping off the bus and onto the pavement. Her feet felt heavy as she walked toward the station doors, her heartbeat pounding like a drum in her chest. She wasn't sure what she expected to find. Maybe nothing. Maybe just an empty platform and a hollow feeling in her heart. But then, she saw him, a face from the past. At first, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. An old man sat on the very same bench where John used to wait, his hands resting on the top of a worn cane. His once dark hair had turned silver, and the lines on his face told a lifetime of stories. But his eyes hadn't changed. Deep brown, kind, searching, as if they had never stopped looking for something. For someone. Her breath caught in her throat. Bruno sensed her hesitation and nudged her forward, his warm presence giving her the strength to take another step. The old man looked up. His gaze met hers. For a moment, there was no sound. No wind, no passing trains, no murmuring of travelers in the background. Only the two of them. Then, in a voice that trembled with something she couldn't quite name, he spoke. Mary. Her fingers curled around the letter in her pocket, her vision blurred with tears. She covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking. And then, with every ounce of breath left in her body, she whispered, John. The name was a prayer, a hope, a lifetime of unsaid words wrapped in a single sound. His grip tightened on his cane. His eyes, those same deep brown eyes, shimmered with emotion. For 50 years, she had thought this moment would never come. And yet, after all this time, John had still been waiting. A love that never faded. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The past and present seemed to blur, dissolving into the space between them. The years that had separated them no longer felt real, as if time itself had folded in on this very moment, bringing them back to where they had left off. John was the first to stand. It was slow, careful, the movement of a man whose body had felt the weight of the years, but whose heart still carried the strength of youth. He gripped his cane tightly, his fingers slightly trembling as he took a step forward. Mary's breath hitched. Is it really you? He asked softly, his voice a fragile echo of the man she had once known. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. Yes, she whispered. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the letter, the one she should have received 50 years ago, the one that had been buried under the earth for so long. She held it up with a weak smile. I got your letter, John, she said, her voice breaking. I'm sorry I was late. John's breath shuddered. A small disbelieving laugh escaped him, a sound filled with both wonder and heartbreak. He looked at the paper in her hands as if seeing a ghost, his eyes clouding with emotion. Then he did something Mary never expected. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out another letter. It was old, worn, edges frayed from being unfolded and refolded 1,000 times. Mary's chest tightened. I never stopped carrying it, John murmured. Even when I thought you'd never come, even when I convinced myself you had moved on, I couldn't let go. Her hands trembled as she took a step closer. "I thought you had forgotten me," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. John smiled, but there was sorrow in it. Not for a single day. The weight of everything, the years apart, the missed chances, the silent longing, crashed down on them both. Mary let out a shaky breath. And then, without another thought, she reached for his hand. Their fingers met, softly at first, tentative, like the touch of two souls testing the fragility of time. Then, John's hand tightened around hers, his grip firm despite the years that had weakened him. And just like that, they were young again, the unseen hand of fate. They sat together on the old bench, the weight of 5 decades melting away as they talked. The conversation wasn't rushed. There was no urgency, no desperate need to make up for lost time. Because at that moment, time didn't matter anymore. They spoke of their lives, of the years they had spent apart. John had never married, never truly settled, always feeling as if something was missing. Mary told him about her late husband, about the quiet life she had lived, the love she had found, but the emptiness that had always remained. And then they spoke of what could have been. The years that had been stolen by a single lost letter, a simple twist of fate that had kept them apart. John sighed, shaking his head. "Do you ever wonder?" Mary knew what he meant. What would their life have been like had that letter reached her all those years ago? Would they have built a home together? Had children? Grown old side by side? A pang of regret flickered in her heart, but it didn't linger. Because here they were. Even after everything, fate had found a way to bring them back to each other. She looked at him and smiled. "We can't change the past, John," she said gently, "but we still have today." He turned to her, eyes shining. "Then let's not waste it. A new beginning." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over the station, Mary felt something she hadn't in a long time. Peace. Bruno sat faithfully by their feet, his tail wagging as if he understood the significance of the moment. And maybe he did. After all, he had been the one to find the letter, the one who had brought her back to this place. Perhaps in his own way, he had known all along that she still had a story left to finish. John chuckled, reaching down to scratch behind Bruno's ears. "Your dog's got good instincts," he said. Mary smiled. "He led me home." John's gaze softened. "Then I suppose I owe him my thanks." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the last train of the evening rolled in, steam hissing softly into the air. Then John turned to her with a gentle smile. "Would you like to take a walk?" Mary looked at him, really looked at him, at the man she had lost, the man she had found again. She reached for his hand once more, gripping it firmly. "I'd love to." And with that they rose, two souls who had waited a lifetime to find their way back to each other. Not looking back, only forward, toward whatever time they had left, together. This ending provides deep emotional closure while leaving a sense of hope, fate, and second chances. It highlights the idea that some loves never truly fade. Some simply wait for the right time to return. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.